Today we got some more actual history about Lewis Wetzel. We'll be reading from this book, The Life and Adventures of Lewis Wetzel, by Robert Cornelius V. Myers. This book was published all the way back in 1890. Now, in this recent video about Lewis Wetzel's life, we read a story from a different book that said that Lewis's father, John Wetzel, died in 1787 after he was attacked in a canoe when Lewis was already 23 years of age. Today we're going to read an entirely different account of John Wetzel's death. By this account, his death occurred in 1777 when Lewis was only 13 years old. In the early spring of 1764, a family of immigrants wended its way through the wilds of Pennsylvania, out to the almost unbroken West. It was the family of a poor farmer, John Wetzel by name, from Lancaster or its immediate vicinity, an up-country Dutchman of more than average intelligence, bent on trying for a new home in the less claimed portions of His Majesty's colonies. There was his wife, a strong, helpful woman, and two children, both sons, the older 2 years of age, the younger perhaps 2 months. It is with this infant that this narrative has to do. When he had become a man moving through the stirring scenes, a prominent figure, yet seeming alone and aloof from others. This day, however, he lay with his mother at the bottom of the wagon which contained all that belonged to his father, who drove the pair of hardy asses that plodded patiently along the heavy, unkempt roads, his 2-year-old boy on the seat beside him. They had started early in the morning on this bright spring day, when all nature vied to keep and hold them back. The birds sang the songs they had known always. The dear old-fashioned flowers beckoned them only to stay. The dogs barked their remonstrances. The sad-eyed cows leaned over the rails, or raised their heads from the juicy young clover to low out a tender warning that though these travelers went further they would see little that could claim their hearts, so much as what they left behind. There were also a few old men with pipes in their mouth moving across gardens, and the sound of the heavy rattling team brought pleasant-faced women to the doors, and all had a word for the Wetzels, so foolhardily turning their backs upon old associations to face vague and untried new. But John Wetzel had ever been known as a stubborn, self-willed man, hard to turn, and ever since neighbors Eberly and Rosencrantz had left for the proposed settlements in the western part of Virginia, he had chafed and looked with eyes averted on the smallness of his surroundings. John Wetzel, going out with a determination to conquer difficulties, seemed to court those which were almost insuperable. "Settle with us here on Wheeling Creek," urged his old neighbor Eberly after they had arrived. "No," he replied, "there are too many here already. I'm going further up." "But the danger! Had I been afraid of danger, I should have never come here. There seems to me more danger of staying with men than with nature." "Then Indians will be your nature." "I know very little about Indians. I know a good deal about white men." "You are a strange man, Wetzel." "I am as I am," he returned. "And you do not see the wisdom of settling with us here?" "I do not see the wisdom. It may be yours, it is not mine." "Well then, goodbye," they shouted after his wagon. "Goodbye," he replied, and the asses moved on, and trod down the long grasses, and the few settlers after a while lost sight of the wagon. For miles the hardy man went on, and at last sighted a spot that pleased him. It was on Big Wheeling, 14 miles from the river. "You are not afraid?" asked he of his wife as she stepped from the wagon and looked around her. "What is there to be afraid of?" she asked in return, holding her baby closer to her. "Nothing but want, such as we have left behind us," he answered. She put her baby in the wagon with his older brother and set about making a fire and preparing their meal. They lived in the wagon for days until a rude cabin had been erected by John Wetzel, at which his wife was not behindhand in assisting. In 2 weeks they were domiciled in their home. "Thank God," said John Wetzel reverently, "we are now free." If loneliness is synonymous with freedom, then they were indeed free. The spot on which the cabin stood was the most exposed imaginable, on every side open to incursions from Indians, were they bent on hostility. The family was wholly beyond the reach of any prompt aid from the settlement and fort at Wheeling, should succor be needed. But in a little while they made up their minds that they needed no aid. They had left the pent-in life of poverty behind them, and now they reveled in the wealth and prodigality of nature. Their lack of fear created a lack of caution, and in this cabin, so far removed from any signs of civilized life, they set about beginning life anew. It was a happy life for months, even for years. They rarely saw any white man. An Indian now and then stopped at the door, accepted some tobacco, and then moved off. Sometimes a stray Indian woman would come up with dried venison to trade for powder, and would ask to hold the papooses a little while. Then, in fiercely cold weather, even these failed. For months at a time, no human being approached them. The husband and father at rare intervals went to Wheeling for necessary supplies. His wife never went, never had any desire to go. Her time was crowded with duties. Her little family gradually became a large one. 5 children were born here, Jacob, John, and George, and 2 daughters, Susan and Christina. The father, too, had little time for visiting. His children were all too young to be of any assistance to him, and he was in a place where everything must come from personal exertion. Towards the end of the 4th year, the Indian visits were more frequent, and his herd was often stolen from him by night. Then, too, the braves were impudent, and their insults were often very gross. He was also largely engaged in locating lands, and his frequent incursions into the wilds for this purpose constantly exposed him to attacks from hostile tribes, which, however, he seems to have escaped. He had experienced poverty, and to fight that off had been hard enough. Now he was aiming at wealth and ease for his children, and for all he cared, the exertion he had expended to thwart poverty might be increased 100-fold in the acquirement of plenty. The Indian wars were in full rage after he had been there for a few years, and nearer to him came the depredations of the Indians. "But I will not give in," he said. He gathered about him a numerous company of wild horses, reclaimed from savage state by arduous toil, and though these were often preyed upon by the Indians, he took it in good part. This was Indian land, he said, and they let it go to waste. Those horses they thought useless, but I reclaimed them. Now they claim them as their own. And his wife's labors were also exhaustive. She cared for nothing else but her family, and often left alone she became as reckless as her husband. She made deerskin clothes for her husband and boys, and from the scanty supply of wool their few sheep yielded, she spun and wove cloth for herself and her little girls. The land produced little at first because of their small means to procure the necessary implements to cultivate it, and often their few fowls were raided on, and there was but milk for food. Even that sometimes failed, or the cows got astray. In the latter case, she would listen for the tinkling of bells, and hearing them at a great distance in that immense solitude, she would tie her babies in bed, her older children to the door jamb to keep them from being hurt or straying after her, and went herself in search of the cattle, and maybe hours would elapse before she brought them home, hoping that in the interval no hostile Indian had paid a visit to her cabin. The wolves, too, in hard winters, when they were famished and desperate, troubled her. Often at night she used to bar the house, and sit beside the chimney feeding the fire with pine logs to keep the beasts at bay. Her children sleeping on the floor around her, her husband she knew not where, nor whether he was alive or dead. The howls of the creatures outside and their scratching at the ill-made door, urging her on to make a fiercer, hotter fire, and not to sleep nor relax her vigilance for a minute. This was the home-rearing of Lewis Wetzel. It was breeding this atmosphere of daring that made him an object of terror to the bands of restless Indians which roamed about the frontier homes. A man without fear, as he was known to be, a veritable tower of strength upon the infant settlement springing up around him. For Lewis Wetzel came to be considered the right arm of defense by many of the settlers in the vicinity of Wheeling, and while he was never known to inflict any cruelty upon women or children, as has been charged to him, he was revengeful with a deathless hatred upon the Indians because he had suffered an injury at their hands, the sense of which left him not a moment throughout his life, and which in time debarred him from the comforts and satisfaction of friends and lovers. He called himself an Indian hunter, as other men call themselves bear hunters, snake hunters, and the like. And while he would pass over a sleeping animal which it might have been death to him to pass by, and was in his power to procure immunity by killing, he never forgave a single Indian for the wrong he had sustained at the hands of a few. He put reason to shame, and called his wrong his reason. In his earliest youth he heard all the hopeful stories of Indian kindness, how friendly tribes meeting white settlers took them to their camping grounds, feasted them, treated them with all attention, asked no questions as the code of Indians is, loaded them with presents, and then let them go. He He knew of the fortitude of the young Indian chiefs, how much they were compelled to bear, how much torture they were to undergo before they were adjudged competent to call themselves leaders. A chief had once come to his father's cabin, and he had called the Bible the talking leaves, and looked with awe at his mother as she read aloud the language of Christ, speaking to her from the yellow and weather-beaten volume with all the tender love and care the disciples of old knew. He knew that prior to the intercourse of the Indians with the Europeans, their weapons had been bows and arrows, clubs and tomahawks, and spears of wood, curiously ornamented with stones and shells, but that after they had begun traffic with the foreigners, their rude weapons were laid aside for those of iron and other metals, and that before the commencement of the war with Philip, though the trade was strictly restrained by the government of the provinces, the Indians had gotten many firearms and learned how to use them, and not alone upon beasts of prey. He knew that many atrocities attributed to the wandering tribes were committed by renegade white men who joined the tribes for pilfer and carnage. He knew all of this in his earliest boyhood, and had no hatred for the Indians because his wrong had not yet come to dry up the fountain of kindly feeling for a mysterious race indigenous to the land they claimed for their own, a race noble from their very recklessness, claiming what they called theirs by right of precedence, and whose wild blood, like that of their bison, refused to be tamed, or tamed was not to be trusted, because the want of unchained freedom was liable to vent itself in fierce deviltry, when once the taming process had taught it cringing and deceit. When his father's land claims were becoming more and more extended, and he was oftener than ever brought into contact with the Indians who threatened to become hostile, little Lewis Wetzel looked on and listened, amused and entertained. When his father returned from any of his excursions, he would gather the children around him and tell them the comic situations his prowess had led him into. And as Indians always largely figured in these narrations, the most august chiefs were looked upon by the small folks of the family as nothing but court fools. And no hatred is ever bestowed upon that which gives us amusement. There might have been disdain, but surely not so great a passion as hate. And when the father went on any of his quests, the children, standing in the little enclosure, would remind him not to come home without a fresh supply of Indian tales, the fairy stories of children of wild life. It was always Lewis who called loudest, who ventured further from the clearing with his father, for a great love had sprung up in the boy for the father who had waited until he was born, so that he would go away from old troubles and want, and poverty's trials. It was always Lewis who called loudest, who ventured further from the clearing with his father, for a great love had sprung up in the boy for the father who had waited until he was born so that he could go away from the old troubles and want and poverty's trials. It was Lewis who saw his father come home before the others did, watching for him at a little knoll a quarter of a mile from their house. It was Lewis who went to the Monongahela for fish, to await the expected father, who often came a month later than promised. The chair for father was always placed by Lewis, the hottest potatoes allotted to his share. The boy, hearing of the revolting colonies, had his father explain to him the right and wrong of it all. "Oh, if I could go," he said. "There are boys as young as me there." Yet when his father was eager to join the rebels, it was Lewis who cried, "No, no, no, mother and children need you. I need you." When the father had once been to Wheeling and came home with the startling news that the flag which had long been representative of His Majesty's dominion was now everywhere wildly torn down and dishonored, it was Lewis who heard it from his father first, and related it to his brothers and sisters. And when once an Indian claiming 100 horses of his father had been refused, and declared vengeance in consequence, it was Lewis who threw a stone at him for the indignity offered to his father. "My white brother had houses and lands and beasts. Why should he take the red man's?" the Indian asked. "My red brother is mistaken," answered John Wetzel, "for I have taken nothing belonging to him. These horses were wild and unclaimed by my red brother, till I took them and trained them, and tamed them, and found a market for them. Surely they are mine. My white brother shall have 200 wild horses for his 100 tame ones, if he will but give them to me. Why should my red brother give more of his property for what he claims is his? Surely he is mistaken. My white brother has the talking hand. I cannot compete with his slyness. He has stolen our beasts. He has stolen our strength. The white man has come and turned us away from our own. The white man has stolen the red man's land. The red man will steal the landlord's," concluded the baffled Indian, striding away. "Nothing has been stolen," cried John Wetzel, after the retreating figure. "The red man threw away, and what he threw away, the white man picked up." The Indian gave him a significant look of scorn. How could he understand this logic? What seemed to be a small affair was the beginning of almost ceaseless warfare, egged on by a few Indians who had been aiding the British, and who had now deserted and come to their old forest fastnesses. The hitherto peaceable Indians held John Wetzel and the other settlers in a constant state of siege. But it was only seen as play to the children. Martin and Lewis Wetzel had mimic fights between them, representing the Indians and the white man's mode of warfare. The two boys had educated themselves in all the slyness of the Indians. Martin was now 15 years of age, Lewis 13, Jacob 11, and John 9. Yet the fun of the boys was the burlesque of tragedies. The Indians came nearer and nearer, were openly hostile, and fired on any of the little party that ventured beyond their own reserve. In the midst of the now frequently occurring attacks, Lewis was stricken down with smallpox, and his brothers and sisters contracted it from him. With this dreadful contagion, with a scarcity of provisions, and murderous Indians lying in wait, the sum of human misery might by some women be said to be complete. But John Wetzel's wife was not such a woman. She nursed her children, collected food somehow, and helped barricade the insecure cabin. For the cabin had never been thoroughly finished. As with these other settlers, there were always so many more necessary and useful things to claim the attention of the husband and father. She had her cows brought nearer the house, her sheep tethered, and she watched. John Wetzel did not venture out so frequently now as formerly, but remained at home and protected his family. Almost daily, fierce bright eyes could be seen lurking in the bushes, and the muzzle of a musket more than once was detected in the leaves of a tree. At night time the wolves howled as ever, but it was not certain that human voices did not utter some of the wolves' tones, or that the scraping at the door was not a wary Indian looking on the group within. The tragedy was coming that turned Lewis Wetzel from peace and tenderness into an Indian scout, that earned for him the name Hunting Dog, that embittered his life and left him little time for aught but revenge. Yet at this time he was a happy child, just recovering from a long illness, lying securely in his flock bed at night, or gazing up the wide-mouthed chimney during the summer darkness, counting the twinkling stars, and listening with awe to the sounds outside. And himself and his brothers and sisters telling stories of bad spirits of bad Indians, who, debarred from the pleasures of the happy hunting ground, remained upon the earth, cruelly to keep little white children wide awake, and shining like pretty quivering lights, to lead them from their homes into deep bogs and quagmires. Surely at this time John Wetzel, with all his bravery, must in his heart have regretted that he had always disdained the usual precaution of settlers, that of placing his family in one of the stations or forts, instead of carrying them into the thick of dangers that threatened them on all sides when he was absent from them. During these absences towards the last, he constantly found that he was fearing for their safety, yet the very next minute trying to laugh away his fear, and to persuade himself that they were safe. Although at present he remained more than ever at home, yet there were times when he must be away. In the fly season his horses, maddened by the stings of the gauzy-winged creatures, broke from their fastenings and scampered through the high grasses, and took to the Monongahela River. The water offered no obstacle whatever to them, and they swam away. He was often away for days on the mission of gathering the half-broken beasts together again. Then he had his sheep and cows to look after, and on account of the loose sheds he had erected for them, and which he now had no time to strengthen, there was always a likelihood of their straying away. Again he burned for news as to the progress of the fight of the people against all of England, and he would hurry to the settlements for tidings. The country in revolt, bands of desperadoes creating havoc all around him. His little clearing and hut had miraculously escaped visitation, yet every day made him more apprehensive for its safety, and his fear led him into the recklessness of seeking in the far settlements for news, leaving his wife and children unprotected until his return. They are in God's hands, he would say, whether I am near or far. His wife might have pleaded now for removal for the time being to a settlement, but she knew little or nothing as to what was going on so near home, and, strange as it may appear, so close to the scenes of worldwide import, she was far away from them in thought. She had her home to think of, and that was enough for her. She had to try and instill her little knowledge into the minds of her children, to teach them to read from the old Bible, and to tell them that the wide-rolling country around them did not constitute all of the world. Her husband had always protected her, and now he told her little or nothing of what he had heard at the forts or settlements. It boded only for her good. However, when he went away now, he would caution Martin to keep a wary eye on the place. "Why should you caution him now more than formerly?" his wife would ask. "Because Martin is 15 years old now," replied her husband, "almost a man, and he should know some of a man's responsibilities. Suppose anything should happen to me, who would be left but Martin to look after things?" "Oh, husband!" cried the wife, alarmed at such a possibility. "But there is the possibility," he said, "and all the same, Martin must look after the affairs at home now when I am called away, when any danger arises." "What danger can there be?" she asked. He dared not tell her, but when he was on his way home he would look, his heart in his throat, for the first sign of life and peace, and that first sign would usually be Lewis, on the knoll waiting for him. It was now the close of the summer of 1777. The woods around were beginning to soften with mellow tints. The songs of birds were fewer. The rich aromatic haze of dying summer was over all the landscape like a soft iridescent veil. The corn stubble glistened with the dew of early morning, and the crickets were bold and made music pleasant to the peaceful housewife as she went about her multifarious duties. One day John Wetzel made up his mind to go to Wheeling for news. He had not been away from home for a month, and he was anxious to know of what was going on in the outer world, away from his little cabin, and how the fight was going, if for the British or the colonists. A herdsman after a stray flock had come to the cabin one night lately and told him that there were rumors that the fight promised to be a long one, and that eventually all the rebelling colonists would be shot down by His Majesty's troops, who were now in New York preparing for a general wiping out of the whole system and the organization of a new. The herdsman had also told how the report ran that the Indians had been called in by the British in this work of extermination, first as guides in the wild parts of the country, and then as partisans. This last piece of startling news determined John Wetzel. He knew what the war would be if the hostile Indians took part in it. He must know more. While the herdsman was talking, he looked over to his wife. No, she had not heard. She was busy with the children and the Bible. The little group was all about her knees, learning the wondrous story of the wars of old, of King David, of wise Solomon, and the brave women of the times. The soughing of the wind outside was very pleasant to listen to, and far to the north there was a faint crystalline line of light, which proclaimed the advent of cooler weather, the northern lights, the aurora borealis. "Wife," he said suddenly, "I think I will take a run up to the Wheeling the coming week." "Very well," was all she answered, and went on with the old stories. So she knew nothing of the herdsman's talk. In the following week John Wetzel went away. His eyes were all about him, looking inquisitively at every tree, every clump of bushes, but all was as usual. He was away for 2 days. In those 2 days he had found ample corroboration of the herdsman's story, and his face was set and stern as he wended his way towards his cabin. In that lonely ride home, undoubtedly he made up his mind that now at last he must take his family somewhere for more protection than he could afford them. Filled with the tales of horror he had heard at Wheeling, he left the place full of fear for his family. Yet as he plodded along on his horse and got further into the country, and saw all nature at peace, not a sign of change, his fears insensibly grew weaker. When he came to his clearing and saw afar off his little son on the green knoll, he laughed at his weak dread. His wife was at the door when he came up. "Well," he said cheerfully, "back again, any news?" "Why, yes," she answered. "Old Crumpley overturned the milk pail last evening, and the speckled hen was caught in the briars." "Too bad," he rejoined. Yes, she went on, and that old bear that came in last winter and went up to the fire and warmed himself, and you would not have turned him out. Well, he's been here again this morning, and he was in the bushes outside the cowshed. His old nose poked here and there. I don't think he looked like the old bear, but he was the same color, spoke up Lewis. So the news was chronicled, and all that came of it was that John Wetzel determined to kill the bear in order to keep him from becoming too familiar. "Give me a skin," said Martin, but Lewis was looking out towards the bushes and said nothing. "Dang it," exclaimed the father all at once. "What do you think I've forgotten to get at Wheeling?" "Your head?" asked his wife. "Something as important. Powder. The first time I ever did such a thing. The news there clean upset me." "What news?" "News? Oh, nothing much. I must start again tomorrow." "Then why don't you take the girls with you and let them stay with Tom Madison's folks? There's Berta Rosencrantz, a likely girl, would like to have them, I'm sure. You know you've always promised to take them. Can you have them ready in time?" "Ready? Listen to him now. Come, boys, help get this carpet bag filled." In the small cabin all was excitement to get the little ones ready for the exhilarating trip. There was bread to bake so that they might have some loaves, and long, light, spongy cakes to eat on the way, and a bottle of milk was to be tied around the neck of each. Next morning the father and the little girls went away, and at the last minute little John crying so hard to go with them that he was packed off too. It was lonely in the cabin without them, and Martin wandered off with his gun, but Lewis stayed. "Why don't you go with your brother?" asked their mother of him. "I don't want to go," he answered. "The first time you've ever felt that way. Are you sick?" she asked. "No," he answered, and went and sat outside the door, his face towards a clump of bushes. Nearly all day he sat there. The next morning he took up his post there again. "He's fretting for father," commented his mother, watching him. Towards sundown, John Wetzel with his powder came up to the door. "I missed you from the knoll, Lewis lad," he said. The mother made her explanation. "I wasn't fretting about father," cried Lewis, "for father is brave. I only fret about the weak ones, the girls." "Oh ho, it was the girls, was it?" And Lewis made no answer. "And now how is the bear?" asked the father, laying down his powder. "I watched for him," said Martin, "but I didn't get a chance at him." "A chance? Father, he dodged me when he saw me." "That's a queer bear," said John Wetzel. "I don't think it is a bear," said Lewis, speaking for the first time. "What do you think it is, old man?" asked his father, laughing. "A whale, maybe? Did you see his skin?" "It's a bear's skin," replied the boy. "A bear's skin carries a bear," said the father. "I don't think it's a bear," reiterated Lewis. "What do you think it is, then?" "An Indian with a bear's skin." "Lewis," cried his mother shrilly, "what do you mean by such nonsense? An Indian indeed! If it's an Indian, why should he hide out there, you foolish boy?" "He saw me watching him." "You are dreaming," said his mother, but the father said nothing. John Wetzel, when night settled down dimmer and darker, fastened the door securely, and for the first time in many months, his wife was astonished at his timidity and laughed at him. "And only a bear," she said. She took up her station beside the fire, which felt very comfortable this chilly evening. Her husband sat on the opposite side of the fire, shading his face with his hand. The boys gathered about their mother, and soon the quaint old story of the wars of the Bible sounded through the place. All was peace and gentleness. "What was that?" said the father once. "What is it?" asked his wife, pausing, with her finger on the word at which she had stopped. "Go on," he said. "It was only a rustling outside." "Why, John," she cried merrily, "you are as nervous as a cat. What is the matter with you? If this comes of going to the settlements, you'd better remain at home." She took up her reading once more. For perhaps 15 minutes she read aloud, the light of the fire shining on the page before her, and making huge shadows in the place, when an exclamation from Lewis attracted her. She looked up. Her husband had gone from the fireplace, and was over against the door, his eye at a knothole there. "Why, John," she began. "Hush," he whispered. There was a rustling outside the door, and a pressure against it. She laughed. "It's the old bear," she said, "and you ought to be ashamed of yourself to be thus easily scared." "Come here," he said. She went to him and, guided by him, placed her eye to the knothole. Outside, one by one, tall shadows passed by the door. There must have been 25 shadows. Each shadow, as it went along, pressed softly up to the door, then joined the other shadows collected a little apart from the house, in an ominous company. "What is it?" she whispered, awe in her voice. "Indians," he whispered in reply. "But why do they come thus?" "Wait." They had not long to wait. The shadows again separated and went to the back of the cabin. There came a weird, soft tramp in the night, a soft tramp that carried a grim purpose with it. Then came a burst at the door, and a plank gave way. Through the opening made, thus John Wetzel fired his gun. There was a shriek outside. "What have you done?" wailed his wife, wringing her hands. "Murder," he said, "and they will do more." She ran back to her boys and clasped them to her, wildly praying to the supreme power to guard them all from harm. She looked at her husband. He was white as death. "You cannot hold out against them," she said. "No," he answered. "Then why not ask them what they want? Look!" There was a thin streak of yellow light shining in from the night outside, through the opening left by the shattered plank. Her look told her everything. "Fire!" whispered John Wetzel. "They are going to burn us!" cried the agonized woman. There was a rasping sound all around the cabin, as the silent fiends outside piled up branches from the dry trees into a mountain over the little cabin. Then there came a tender crackling. Then 50 thin threads of flame sprang up. Then for the first time there was a sound of voices outside, a shout of joy. Once again John Wetzel's bullet sped on its way, even once more, and the place was as though filled with a great sun, so light the flames were. A great blazing log tumbled in on the floor. The roof was a mass of tinder. The place was scorching hot, and outside, joining with the shouts of the Indians, came the frightened bellowing of liberated cattle and the bleating of scurrying sheep, while the quick stamps on the ground told of loosened half-wild horses making for the river. The mother had torn a blanket from the bed and thrown it over the boys to protect them from the flames. The smoke filling the place blinded her. She could no longer see her husband. A part of the roof then fell in, and with it came a crowd of yelling Indians. "John! John!" she shrieked, and hurried towards the place where she thought he must be. She was jostled against by the fighting Indians, who were now stamping on the fire to put it out. She caught a glimpse of her husband in the arms of 3 or 4 painted Indians, hurried from the cabin, struggling for his life. Shrieking, she was after him. She had almost touched him when a gleam of something bright blinded her, a tomahawk in the hands of a fierce brute, over her husband's head. There was a quick movement of the Indian's hand, a whoop from his lips as the instrument descended into a dull thud and crashed through the skull of John Wetzel. Then she knew no more. The early morning light brought its dew and songs of birds. The wife and mother had fallen in the long, rank grass, had been completely hidden from her would-be murderers. She raised herself and looked around. There was the moldering cabin, that was all. She knew that her husband was killed. She had seen the deed done. She thought her children had been burned up with the cabin. Groaning in her agony, she determined to make her way to Wheeling, where her other children were. Fierce and weak, clutching her arms, she fled on. On her way, stray cattle came and looked at her, cows begging her only to stop and milk them. Wild-eyed horses gazed at her, their manes blowing in the morning breeze, and dumbly asking her where was the corn they had so long been used to of mornings. She knew these were a part of her home, now hers no longer. Stumbling on, looking straight before her, she made her way, a widow with 3 children less than she had last night, into the fort at Wheeling, where she fell unconscious, moaning unintelligibly. But the boys had not been murdered as their mother's despair had suggested to her. Martin, the eldest, in the earliest moment of the assault, had dropped from a window and flown across the lurid meadow, the yells of the Indians growing fainter and fainter as he sped along, his mother's cries the last sound that rang in his ears. In the morning he crept back to the scene of ruin and desolation, only to send his voice to heaven for his lost or slaughtered kindred. But the 2 younger boys had been discovered by the Indians, beneath the blanket in the burning hut, where Lewis had been struck in the breast by a bullet which tore away a piece of the bone. The conquerors spared these boys because of their extreme youth, and drove them before the band across the country as captives. On the way, by the light from his burning home, Lewis, looking down, saw in the crushed and trampled grass the mutilated body of his father. The boy stopped abruptly and seemed to turn to stone. He looked around, and in the red light, as far as his eye could reach, rolled the boundless prairie, with groups of beasts huddled close together, gazing with wild, affrighted eyes upon the strange lights. Great birds swept by towards the burning building, wheeled about it afar off, the circles eddying nearer to the flame, nearer and nearer still, until, with shrill cries, they darted into the heart of the flame, and perished there. There was a soft crackling in the grass, and spots of fire leaped up here and there. The moon looked red and sullen through the smoke. That was what the boys saw. His brother at his side was bitterly weeping and cowering before their red enslavers, but Lewis Wetzel shed no tear, uttered no groan. "Did you see Father there in the grass?" wept his brother. There was no reply. "Father is dead!" wept his brother. Still there was no reply to his wailing. Yet in that instant of horrid sight, there had come to the silent boy the bitter hatred that never left him thereafter. Something that had meant life and being to him went from him into the dead body of his father. A hush came upon him that left its impression forever after in his face. The love he bore the murdered man lived with tenfold intensity and deadened every other natural feeling. But that love, having nothing now on which to expend its wealth in fond endearments and happy hopes, turned the outrage done it into irrevocable hatred against the slayers, and their whole kind, a fiendish perfection of hatred that bordered closely upon madness, but which had not a grain of madness in it, any more than madness may be said to actuate any feeling of retaliation for wrongfully inflicted suffering. In the simple and untutored communities, however, through which the scout afterwards moved, he was often said to be not quite sane. So that's it for this episode. This was a very different account of John Wetzel's death than the one provided by Wills de Haas in his 1851 book, History of Western Virginia. This was published 39 years before the book we just read from by Robert Meyer. We will probably never know for sure which account of John Wetzel's death is true, but this account seems to make it a little more clear why Lewis Wetzel developed the intense hatred that he did. Since he saw his father's dead body right after he had been killed, and he was kidnapped in the same event. However, most of the official records suggest that John Wetzel's death occurred in 1786, which is more consistent with the canoe story. Feel free to say what story of John Wetzel's death you think is true in the comments. This channel is called Unworthy History because we are dedicated to presenting actual history that is now deemed unworthy of being shown on history channels on TV. Those channels have abandoned their mission and no longer show very much actual history anymore. But here on this channel, we keep actual history alive. History about people who lived much harder lives than we have to. People who prepared the peace that we enjoy today. People whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe. And we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.